It's sad to see a team leave, not because of financial problems, but because of an owner being a bitch. I mean, it's happened in all four major sports and all that. For baseball, it's got to be Charlie Finley swiping a team from Kansas City, the Kansas City Athletics, and moving it to Oakland, pissing off the Missouri Senator so much he wanted a lawsuit over antitrust with baseball. And baseball decided to put the Kansas City Royals in baseball in 1969. For basketball, it's Seattle with Clay Bennett promising to give Seattle a voice and to keep the Sonics in Seattle. And all of a sudden, he decides to quickly broker a deal to get the team to Oklahoma City, pissing off people in the Pacific Northwest and bringing people in Oklahoma, a basketball team, back after the Hornets went back to New Orleans. For hockey, well, sorry, for football, it's got to be Al Davis just basically being a malcontent, being a Karen, if you will, and just moving the team from Oakland back to LA, back to Oakland because he just was being a bitch towards Pete Rozelle and Paul Tagliabue. But nothing can compare in hockey to this sad story. And I know that you'd be thinking, oh, this is a story about the Winnipeg Jets or the Quebec Nordiques because, I'm from Canada and all that. But no, it's not. Ownership weren't being bitches when they moved the team from Winnipeg to Arizona and Quebec to Colorado. It was just they were financially unstable, and Bettman did everything in his freaking power to put hockey in the South. I'm talking about a team with a great hockey history in their state. Heck, their high school tournament is so popular. It's at the Minnesota Wild Arena. Like there's bloodbaths and all that, and that's creepy. But nevertheless, we're going to take a look at the Minnesota North Stars in their last great season of 1991-92. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter with NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup to the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name. And I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! So let's talk about the Minnesota North Stars. The state of Minnesota always had great hockey. Their college team, the Minnesota Golden Gophers, fantastic. There have been a few Minnesota offshoots like Minnesota Duluth and St. Cloud State who have done pretty well for themselves in college hockey. Hockey is everything, including the high school tournament and action I talked about. But Minnesota never seemed to have an NHL team. However, the NHL put the Great Expansion in 1967 and helped them out. So the Great Expansion is of 6 teams to add on to the original 6 of Montreal, Detroit, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto. I think I said Detroit twice. I said Boston. Never mind. So anyway, they added 6 more teams in. California got 2 teams, Los Angeles and Oakland. I mean, Oakland, really? We really need a second California team in the NHL? St. Louis, who actually didn't have a formal bid, but because St. Louis Arena was owned by the Wirtzes, the Chicago owners, basically, it was just a quid pro quo deal. Pittsburgh and Philadelphia getting teams in Pennsylvania, which wasn't bad. I mean, Pittsburgh and Philly did have good backgrounds. And of course, the state of Minnesota, as the Minnesota North Stars become to Bloomington. It was kind of cool. The University of Minnesota brought some players to the U.S. Olympic team for 1960 in what is called the Forgotten Olympic gold medal miracle compared to 1980. So anyhow, the North Stars were decent. In 1968, they got to the conference finals. Well, the division final, the Western Division final against the St. Louis Blues. They had, no, they didn't have. Who did they have? Gary Bowman in net, or Charlie Hodge? No, Hodge was the Seals. Nevertheless, the North Stars took St. Louis to a game 7, and were one step away from going to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time. But unfortunately, Ronnie Schock scored in double overtime, and the Blues got to the final against the Habs and not the North Stars. The North Stars had some great players. Bill Goldsworthy, of native of Waterloo. Danny Grant was pretty good with them. Drew Drouin, JP Parise. I would say Charlie Burns, but I'm probably wrong. Of course, the goaltending of Cesar Menigo and Gump Worsley when he left Montreal because, he had the air travel problems. But no North Star could compare to Bill Masterton or what would have been. Masterton was a pretty good college hockey player and a Montreal prospect. He wasn't really going to get through to the Habs because, the Habs had a logjam at center. So he decided to leave hockey and go work for Honeydew, for space exploration. So while working for Honeydew, he was actually told that the NHL was going to expand and that the Minnesota North Stars would like to have him on its roster. Masterton agreed and played decently, but one mid-January day, 1968, at the Bloomington Ice Arena against the Oakland Seals, things just blew up. As Ron Harris and it's going to kill me who the second guy was, made a hit on Masterton. A decent hit, but Masterton hit his head on the ice and blood was everywhere. Unfortunately, Masterton would die of his injuries a couple days later. Oh, no, Larry Cahan, that's it. Cahan and all that. But unfortunately, fortunately for the two Oakland defenders, they weren't charged with anything. But Masterton's death was huge. It was the first NHL fatality, and that made players wear helmets from now on. And of course, Masterton's name is part of the trophy for perseverance and all that. So the North Stars were okay. In the 70s, not too much to write about. But in 1978, one of the biggest moments in Minnesota North Stars history happened. And that was when the North Stars ended up getting players from the Cleveland Barons. The Seals turned into the Cleveland Barons, and then the NHL, deciding not to let a team fold, decided to merge the Cleveland Barons players with the Minnesota North Stars players. They would be North Star players. And the last Cleveland Baron was Dennis Murrock, by the way, to play in the NHL. Nevertheless, so the North Stars picked up these players, and it actually worked out. In 1980, they shocked the world in the quarterfinals of the playoffs by shocking the four-time defending Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens in a Game 7 in Montreal. Al McAdam was the hero. The North Stars did their job and lost to the Philadelphia Flyers in the semifinals because the Flyers then lost to the the Islanders in the final. The North Stars would make the final in 1981 when this undrafted rookie by the name of Dino Ciccarelli came out of effing nowhere and led the team in goal scoring in the playoffs. And the North Stars went to the final and took care of things, but lost to the Islanders in 5 games. The North Stars would be up and down for most of the 80s. In 1988, they actually won by losing. On the final weekend, the North Stars and Leafs were battling for that 4th and final spot in the divisional round and a chance to meet the Detroit Red Wings. The North Stars would lose a key game late in the season, and the Leafs would beat the Red Wings. But it actually worked out for the North Stars because, unbeknownst to the Leafs, if they had lost, the number 1 draft pick, there was no draft lottery, so it went to the worst team in the NHL. And the worst team in the NHL was the Minnesota North Stars. So lo and behold, the North Stars had the number 1 pick and took Mike Modano, who would be a Minnesota/Dallas icon. And the Leafs were in the playoffs, got blown out 8-0, and threw jerseys on the ice. True story. So the North Stars were there. And then in 1990, there was a massive move. The Gunn brothers, who actually had ownership of the North Stars, wanted to sell off the North Stars and then move the team to San Jose. And because they had interest in Silicon Valley. However, the NHL said no way. But they made a deal with the Guns that they could have ownership of the Sharks as an expansion team. So San Jose would get an expansion team in 1991. But the North Stars were to be sold off. So guess who they gave it to? Norm Green. It seemed like a decent move at the time. And heck, the North Stars in 1991-92 had to take part in the expansion draft and a dispersal draft. More on that when I talk about the 92 North Stars in detail, but likelihood. But yeah, it was a messy situation, which I will explain within the video. But the fact was the North Stars sucked. Norm Green was just a bitch because he sold the team to Dallas and Minnesota was without hockey. They almost got hockey back in 1995, because the Winnipeg Jets were rumored to move to Minnesota, which would have been a decent move because Winnipeg and Minneapolis were close, but it fell through. Winnipeg kept their team, and then they moved to Phoenix of all places. Fortunately for Minnesota, the NHL decided to give them an expansion team in 2000 alongside Columbus. So the Minnesota Wild were born. Hockey was big, and in 2003 they really made a wave. In their third full season, they got to the playoffs. They faced the Colorado Avalanche. Were down 3-1, and lo and behold, Minnesota would come back and force a game 7 in Denver and beat Colorado thanks to Andrew Burnett's goal, retiring Patrick Roy. Of course, I'm pissed off because Patrick Roy is my idol. Not only that, the Wild went on to face the Vancouver Canucks, who were also coming off a 3-1 comeback against the St. Louis Blues. And lo and behold, Vancouver was up 3-1. So it looked like the Canucks were going to go to the conference finals. The Wild again comes back from 3-1 down and beats the Canucks badly in Game 7, putting Dan Cloutier on notice of him being a crappy goalie. Minnesota went on to the conference finals against the Anaheim Ducks, another Cinderella team, and somehow the Wild could not beat the Ducks and J.A. Sugar for crap. So the Ducks got to the Stanley Cup Finals. I think Minnesota would get their asses handed to them. I could have easily made that there. But let's face facts. This is not Minnesota Wild. This is the North Stars. And of course, I talked about Dallas. I will be talking about Dallas and their stuff a little later. But the fact of the matter is that's what happened. State of hockey. So let's talk about the 91-92 North Stars, shall we? So the 92 North Stars was the North Stars' 25th anniversary team and the penultimate season, meaning the second last season in Twin Cities. A major aspect was that they actually lost players to the San Jose Sharks expansion team. And the North Stars were permitted to select players from other teams in an expansion draft. Despite a diminished roster, they actually did take fourth in the division because the Leafs were not there yet, if you will, because 4 out of 5 teams made the playoffs in the North Division. And they lost to the Red Wings. So the North Stars would adopt a new logo for the 91-92 season, retiring the original N with the star logo, which was pretty cool. Now, if you watched the 1991 Stanley Cup Finals, you would see that the whole North Stars, their new logo, the stars, like you see right here in that patch with Modano facing off against Goldsworth. Yeah, the stars thing that was plastered over the arena the board advertisements at the Met Center. So you knew they had to change the logo and all that. So yeah, so they put a new uniforms. Black was the primary color. So they had single color block letters by the start of the season. Well, Norton Green would operate the North Stars, but Howard Baldwin and Morris Belzberg weren't happy. Both Baldwin and Belzberg would sell to Green. And ironically enough, they would actually pair up those two to buy the Pittsburgh Penguins from Eddie DeBartolo Sr. So Minnesota in the 91 draft had the 8th overall pick. It took Richard Matvichuk from the Saskatoon Blades. Good player. And then otherwise they didn't really pick that well. But in the 4th round, their next pick was a big one. Mike Torchia, good goalie, legendary player for, you guessed it, Kitchener. So let's give you Mike Torchia's stuff because I'm a Kitchener Ranger icon. Named Memorial Cup All-Star team. Too bad that Eric Lindros and those pesky Oshawa Generals had to ruin the Memorial Cup for the Rangers in 1990. He only played 6 games in the NHL, 3 wins, 2 losses, and a tie. He was, I think he had some kind of mental health issues or something that kind of prevented him from doing well in the NHL. But yeah, he did quite well for the Kitchener Rangers and all that. Yeah, so yeah. 91-92 Kitchener Rangers. Well, nevertheless, sorry about that. I have a lot of things. So anyway, yeah. dispersal draft. So here's what it was. There was a compromise for the 1990-91 season. The previous owners of the North Stars, the Gunn Brothers, were awarded an expansion team in the Bay Area that would be called the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks would get players via dispersal draft with the North Stars. North Stars players that are on the main roster and on their minor league roster. And the 92 Sharks had 14 former North Stars players. So from within the North Stars organization, they took Shane Shurla, who was the tough guy for the North Stars, Brian Hayward, who was a pretty good backup for the North Stars behind John Casey, Neil Wilkinson, Rob Settler, future Leaf, Link Getz, who was an enforcer, Pat McLeod. I remember having his card with the Sharks. Neil Wilkinson's card with the Sharks I had. Brian Hayward's card with the Sharks. Rob Settler. Mike McHugh's card with the Sharks. Yarmo Malays from the North Stars organization. Rob Goudreau, the father of John, the uncle of Johnny Goudreau. Arturs Irbe was in the North Stars situation. Now he was a Shark. He would be later known a couple years later in '94 for playing well for the Sharks. Tom Patterson and Doug Smolik. So after the expansion draft, the North Stars decided to get rid of Kelly Kissio to the Sharks to get Shane Shula back. I don't know if that was a good idea. So then they played in the expansion draft. So what would happen is with the Sharks and the North Stars would take part. Each one of the 20 NHL squads would lose a player, and they had to draft one player from each organization. So the North Stars took Rob Ramage from the Leafs organization. Well, Ramage was a former captain, and he was a terrible person and all that. Later on in life, Dave Babich from the Whalers came along. He would be better as a Canuck in '94. Charlie Huddy was drafted from the Oilers in the expansion draft. Wow, they got Charlie Huddy. Kelly Kissio, well, after the expansion draft, well, they took Kissio from the Rangers organization, who was their captain at one time. Randy Gillihan from the Penguins from West Germany, and Guy Lafleur from Quebec, because they had to take someone from Quebec, and they took Guy Lafleur, but they would trade him back to Minnesota for Alan Haworth, if memory. Yeah, they traded him back to Quebec for Alan Haworth. So the North Stars gave up 22 shorthanded goals, which was tied with the 85 Penguins for the most in history at the time, I think. Yeah, the North Stars would score 70 points, just ahead of the Leafs, who had 67. The Leafs were coming back from the dark days of Ballard, but not enough. If it was 1-8, the North Stars would not have qualified. Calgary had 74 points and missed the playoffs because the Jets had 81. So the North Stars would have missed the playoffs anyway. In the playoffs, they would take on the Detroit Red Wings and were actually up 2-0 in Detroit, proving how bad Detroit was. And Detroit was still rebuilding. After all, the Red Wings actually had a 3-1 series lead on the St. Louis Blues and choked it in the first round of '91. Then Detroit would win in overtime. I can't remember who scored that one because I know who scored in 6. But Minnesota won that home. They're up 3-1. All they had to do was win in Detroit and sink the Red Wings and move on to the next round. They got shut out 3-0 by Tim Shovelday. And then they played Game 6, which was a tough one. And then supposedly Sergei Fedorov scored top shelf, but they didn't agree. So for the first time in NHL history, a game-winning goal was scored through instant replay. And yes, Fedorov's shot was under the crossbar, and Shovelday had another shutout. And then Detroit crushed Minnesota 5-2. Of course, nobody would know the drama of 1993 with the North Stars and Norm Green being an asshole, but just wanted to let you know. It was weird. I mean, like, the Minnesota North Stars, the team that magically got to the Stanley Cup Finals against Mario and the Penguins in 1991, had to lose so many players to the San Jose Sharks organization. They had to take part in the expansion draft. That was kind of creepy. But nevertheless, what would happen if the 92 North Stars actually did get to the second round? Let's take a look. All right, so the 92 North Stars, you see them, they would play the Chicago Blackhawks, who won the other North Division matchup. So the North Stars would have shocked the world, 10 games below 500, trying to do what they did in 1991 and get to the finals that way. After all, the 91 North Stars shocked the Blackhawks, who were the best team in the NHL, who were the President's Cup winner in '91. And then North Stars took care of St. Louis, who only were one back of Chicago in the point standing. And then they beat the Oilers, who were the 1990 Stanley Cup champs, before Pittsburgh got them. So let's see, game one. Game one would have seen the North Stars win in overtime. Alf Dollar and Mike Modano for the North Stars. Steve Thomas would have made 2-1. Darian Hatcher, remember him? He was a North Star. He gets ejected for kneeing. Shane Sherlock will have to serve the 10-minute penalty. No, the 5-minute major for kneeing. And then the third period, they with Brian Bellows, Kitchener in the box for elbowing Steve Smith. Remember him, Oiler fans? You let him leave because of your heckling of him. Steve Smith made it 2-2. And in overtime, it went to double overtime. Chelios and Johnson were both hit for penalties. The North Stars had Tenority go off for charging. Marchment, Larmer, and Grimson all went penalties for Chicago, but the North Stars, unlike 1991 against the Blackhawks, could not capitalize on the power play. But then Chris Chelios got in trouble for knee in double overtime, and then Alf Dolan scored to make it 3-2 North Stars. So Casey, Belfour, and Dolan were in the nets. Belfour gave up 69 shots, Casey 67. Game two would see the North Stars win again, 5-4. So Jeremy Roenick being 1-0, Bellows made it 1-1. Kitchener, and then Bellows got double minded for charging, but then there was a problem. Brian Marchment got in trouble for fighting but instigating, so he was practically gone. Steve Larmer made it 2-1 Blackhawks, and then Steve Smith, a 5-minute cross-checking penalty. Peluso would have to serve the penalty, and unfortunately for Steve Smith, that was an ejection, and the Blackhawks were down a defenseman. But it didn't matter. They didn't give up a power play goal. And then Mike Peluso got in trouble for boarding and got ejected, so Stu Grimson would have to serve the penalty. Dave Gagne tied it at 2, and then Alf Dolan and Craig Woodley. Remember him? The guy who only had one pair of shin pads for 17 years? Made it 4-2. Hawks made it 4-3 Steve Thomas, but then Adam Creighton got a 5-minute charging call and got ejected. Jeremy Roenick did score shorthanded, and then on the power play of the 5-minute charging call, Mark Tenority scored from Mike Craig. So Steve Smith, Mike Peluso, and Adam Creighton were all ejected for the Blackhawks. That kind of led to them losing. Casey, Roenick, and Larmer are your 3 stars. Yeah, John Casey doing his job. So the Blackhawks were in trouble. They were down 2-0. Game 3 would see the North Stars win 5-4. Brent Sutter, remember him? He scored for the Hawks to make it 1-0. Matteau. Stefan Matteau was a Hawk. Before he was a New York Ranger, he scored to make it 2-0. Modano made it 2-1. Darian Hatcher scored on the power play to tie it at 2. And then Brian Bellows put up a pair of goals, helping the former Kitchener Ranger to prominence. Mike Peluso made it 4-3. Rob Brown made it 4-4. And then, with time running out, Dave Gagne scored to make it 5-4 North Stars. Bellows, Brown, and Chelios are your 3 stars. Kitchener. So anyway, Chicago's like, fuck it, we're down 3-9. Let's get Hasek in net. And it didn't work because the North Stars shocked the Blackhawks and would have went on to the semifinals. Chicago can't believe they lost to the North Stars again. I did nothing to make that sort. Blackhawks were up 2-0. Michel Goulet, remember him? And Steve Thomas. But then Alf Dolan, Mike Craig, and Shane Sherlock scored. Steve Thomas made it 3-3. Modano made it 4-3. Brent Sutter made it 4-4. Brian Bellows and Gaetan Duchesne scored. And then Hasek was replaced by Roy LeBlanc, who didn't give up a goal, but the Hawks couldn't score. As Dolan, Thomas, and Bellows are your 3 stars, and John Casey was a freaking beast. So that means the 92 North Stars will be there. I just want to check. I just want to do this for the heck of it. Yeah, look at comparison. Well, if you look at comparison, the 92 North Stars were only 2 points ahead of the 1991 North Stars because they had 5 more wins, but the 91 North Stars had 8 more ties. So that's 10 points to 2. I'm just being cheeky. So the Edmonton Oilers were the team to win the other division. So, of course, we don't change that. So the Oilers at 36, 34, and 10 with Bill Ranford in the net and the immortal Peter Ing in net. They got Ron Tugnutt from the Nordiques to be the backup to Ranford. So yeah, Casey versus Ranford. And remember that? Dave Manson. Luke Richardson, Kevin Lowe. So yeah, Vince Damphousse was an Edmonton Oiler for what 1 year, and then he got traded to Montreal for who did they trade? Rushinsky? I can't remember who Montreal traded back to Edmonton. Oh, Shane Corson. That's it. So anyway, in the playoffs, um, game one would go to the North Stars 5-4. Dave Manson scored shorthanded for the Oilers. And then Craig Ludwig and Joe Murphy would fight. Brian Bellows, Kitchener, tied it at 1, and then Modano made it 2-1. Semenoff made it 2-2. Dave Manson made it 3-2 for Oilers, but Brian Bellows made it 3-3, and then got a hat trick at the end of the second period. Peter Klima tied it, and then Dave Gagne scored to make it 5-4. Bellows, Manson, and Klima are your 3 stars of the day. Brian Bellows looking pretty good. Game 2, so the North Stars win again, 3-2. Mike Craigs did it. Bernie Nichols, left the Rangers for the Oilers. He got ejected for charging 5-minute major charging. DeBrusk had third penalty. Bye bye Nichols. Joe Murphy tied it at 1. Shane Shula got a 5-minute cross-checking call and got ejected. And then Mike Modano put up a pair of goals. Semenoff made it 3-2, and the North Stars hung on. As Modano, Ranford, and Casey are your 3 stars of the game. Ranford gave up 50 shots. But yeah, North Stars are up 2-0 on the Oiler drop. Game 3 sees the North Stars win 8-5. Wow. Joseph Bragg scored for the Oilers, but then Alf Dolan scores a first period hat trick. Bellows scored as well. Brian Bellows made it 5-1, and Manfred was replaced by Norm Foster. Barada made 5-2. Bernie Nichols made it 5-3 Oilers, and then Scott Thornton, the former Leaf, who was traded to the Oilers in the Grant Fuhr trade, got ejected for cross-checking. Scott Thornton. Alf Dolan made it 6-3 North Stars. Joe Murphy made it 6-4. Todd Ellick made it 7-4 North Stars. Damphousse made it 7-5, and then Mike Modano scored on the power play 8-5. So Norm Foster did not really have a good night in net. Dolan, Bellows, and Modano are your 3 stars. And again, they're down 3-0. So the Oilers decided to use Ron Tugnet because that's why they got him. And it worked. The Oilers win game 4 by a score of 8-4 going home. Todd Ellick was ejected for knee. Nichols and Klima made it 2-0. Brian Bellows made it 2-1. A double liner for the Oilers, and the North Stars could only capitalize once. Dave Gagne made it 2-2. Neil Brown made it 3-2. The Pride of Minnesota. Craig Simpson tied it at 3. Luke Richardson made it 4-3 Oilers. He also was traded from the Leafs to the Oilers. Brian Bellows tied it at 4. Dave Manson made it 5-4. Semenoff made it 6-4. Casey was replaced by Darcy Wakaluk. Joe Murphy got a goal to make it 7-4, and Basil McRae got ejected. So Wakaluk did okay. Klima, Bellows, and Semenoff, your 3 stars. Yeah, Ellick and McRae out for Minnesota. So they go back to Edmonton. Edmonton looking pretty good, and didn't work. It didn't work. Edmonton thought they were gonna be okay, but the North Stars win 5-3 to beat the Oilers, just like 91. Yeah, just like 91. They beat the Blackhawks just like 91. And they beat the Oilers just like 91. So they go back to the final against Pittsburgh. Of course, we don't change the other conference. Damphousse scored to make it 1-0 Oilers. Yeah, he was a Leaf. He was him, Thornton, and Richardson, and Peter Ing were traded from Toronto Edmonton for what was it? Craig Berube. I think it was Craig Berube who was traded alongside Grant Fuhr and Glenn Anderson. Anyway, Dolan tied it at 1. Brian Bellows made it 2-1 for the North Stars. Damphousse made it 2-2. But Craig Gagne and Bellows made it 5-2 and got rid of Tugnutt. Joe Murphy made it 5-3, but it didn't matter. As Ella got hurt, Casey, Damphousse, and Bellows were your 3 stars. Well, Casey gave up 57 shots. So the North Stars go back to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they will face the Pittsburgh Penguins for the 2nd straight season. And yes, Barrasso, Ken Reagan was the backup. They needed a backup and got rid of Frank Pietrangelo, who was with the team but went to the North Stars. And Wendell Young, speaking of Kitchener, Wendell Young was a Kitchener Ranger. Paul Coffey's got to be in at the starting D line with Samuelson. Game 1 sees the North Stars get their asses whipped 6-2. They did score a goal. Chris Dalquist made it that way. Mark Recchi, Brian Trottier, and Kevin Stevens made it 3-1. Of course, the 92 Penguins had all the players, including the ones who were traded, because I know damn well Recchi was traded to Philly for Rick Tocchet. Rory Murphy made it 4-1, and then Phil Borg made it 5-1. Casey was replaced by Wakaluk. Recchi made it 6-1. And then Alfdala made 6-2 and didn't make a difference. Recchi, Barrasso, and Troche, your 3 stars. Shel Samuelson, Troy Loney didn't get a lot of time. Enrico Ciccone, Basil McRae, and Bobby Smith. Wait, why would you have Bobby Smith for 35 seconds? Bobby Smith's an icon. Game 2 sees the North Stars win the game 8-6. A lot of goals in this one. 14 of them. Barrasso was replaced by Wendell Young. Kitchener. So anyway, I'm going to give you the goal scoring thing. Bellows, Coffey, and Stevens, your 3 stars. Amazing. Stars 1 and 2 both are former Kitchener Rangers. Yes, Paul Coffey was a former Kitchener Ranger. Look it up. Brian Bellows with 2 goals. Dave Gagne with 2. Modano, Ludwig, Dolan, and Broaden. Pittsburgh, 2 goals by Stevens. And Coffey, Murphy, Tocchet, and Francis. So the series is not at one skis. Back to Minnesota. Game 3 sees the North Stars lose 6-4. Dolan scored for the North Stars, but then Tocchet and Stevens made it 2-1. Joe Mullen made it 3-1. Phil Borg made it 4-1. Stevens made it 5-1. Casey was replaced in net. Mike Craig made it 5-2, but to no avail. Murphy scored, Modano scored, and then Prop scored. 6-4. Wukluck did well in the net. Stevens, Tocchet, and Murphy, your 3 stars. So on to game 4. And it would be the Penguins beating the tar out of the North Stars to force things back. Shane Shula got ejected for kneeing and was out of the game. Kevin Stevens scored on that power play. Mark Recchi scored on that power play, and so did Mario. Kevin Stevens would be ejected for headbutting and get himself an early shower. The North Stars couldn't take advantage. Larry Murphy made it 4-0. Prop made it 4-1. Mark Recchi 5-1, and Troy Loney made it 6-1. So yeah, Stevens Shillas were ejected. Rob Ramage was hurt. Good. Don't want that asshole there. Lemieux, Murphy, Recchi, the 3 stars. So Penguins are up 3-1. Yeah, I'm going to just leave Casey in there. And that's it. And the North Stars would have lost in 5 games. So Pittsburgh would have changed the narrative. They would have beaten the North Stars in 5 games. And who knows, maybe the North Stars would not have been forced to move to Dallas. Maybe North Green would have known that this could be a mini dynasty. Mario Lemieux was even ejected for a penalty. Mario fucking Lemieux, and they still won the game. Murphy, Stevens, and Bellows, your 3 stars. Bellows, Modano, Dolan, Gagne, and Craig were the goals. Larry Murphy put up 4 goals. A defenseman with a hat trick in the Stanley Cup Finals? Cal Surprise. Grant Jennings scored. I thought Grant Jennings was traded. But yeah, the Pittsburgh Penguins would have forced the North Stars in 5. But at least the Minnesota Miracle would have happened again. Just like 91. But it didn't happen. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond to do.